I stared at the bank statement in my hands, my vision blurring as the numbers seemed to swim before my eyes. The trust fund my grandparents had established for my education, the one that should have contained over $340,000, showed a balance of just $12,476. I looked up at the bank manager, Mr. Patterson, whose expression held a mixture of sympathy and discomfort. "There have been consistent withdrawals over the past 6 years," he explained gently, sliding several pages of transaction records across his desk, "all authorized by your parents as legal trustees." My stomach dropped as I saw the pattern. Each major withdrawal coincided perfectly with another of my sister Vanessa's extravagant emergencies. The designer wedding in Bali, the luxury SUV after her fender bender, the down payment on her beachfront condo, all paid for with the money that was meant to secure my future, and my parents had authorized every single transaction. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Money had always been a complicated subject in the Hayes family. Growing up, I was the practical one, the responsible one, the one who understood the value of a dollar. My sister Vanessa was the opposite, spontaneous, charming, and perpetually in need of just a little help to get through her latest crisis or opportunity. Our parents, especially our father, could never say no to her. "Vanessa just needs more support to find her way," they'd say. "You've always been so independent, Olivia." Independence wasn't a choice I'd made. It was a necessity born from watching how quickly resources vanished when my sister batted her eyelashes. I'd worked through high school, secured scholarships for college, and taken on part-time jobs throughout my undergraduate years. Meanwhile, Vanessa had floated through life with a safety net always ready to catch her. The only financial security I believed I could count on was the trust fund my grandparents had established when I was born. My grandmother, a sharp-minded former accountant who had grown up during the Depression, had been explicit about its purpose. "This is for your education and your start in life, Olivia," she had told me on my 18th birthday, the last time I saw her before she passed away. "Not for frivolous things, but for investments in your future, your education, perhaps a home someday, or even starting a business. Something solid that will grow." I had taken her words to heart, deciding to leave the fund untouched through my undergraduate years, when scholarships and work study covered my needs. My plan was to use it for graduate school, and perhaps a down payment on a modest home afterward. That plan now lay in ruins on Mr. Patterson's polished mahogany desk. "I don't understand," I said, my voice surprisingly steady despite the storm brewing inside me. "How could this happen? I thought there were restrictions on how the trust could be used." Mr. Patterson nodded, his silver-rimmed glasses catching the light from the window. There were specific provisions. Funds were designated for educational expenses, medical emergencies, and certain approved investments. However, he hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. "However," I prompted. "However, there was a clause that allowed your parents, as trustees, to make withdrawals they deemed in the beneficiary's best interest. It's a standard provision meant to provide flexibility for unforeseen circumstances. And they determined that funding my sister's lifestyle was in my best interest?" The bitterness in my voice surprised even me. Mr. Patterson cleared his throat. "Our records indicate that the withdrawal authorization cited family emergency needs and shared family educational resources. We don't typically investigate the specific use of funds beyond the documentation provided." I stared at the withdrawal history. The first significant one had occurred 6 years ago, just after I had started college. $45,000, the exact amount, of Vanessa's destination wedding in Bali, which had been framed as an investment in important family connections since her husband came from a wealthy family. The pattern continued. $38,000 for what I now recognized as the down payment on her luxury SUV after she had scraped the side of her previous car. At the time, my parents had described it as a necessary transportation expense. Then, $120,000 for the beachfront condo, down payment, an investment property for the family, they had claimed. There were dozens of smaller withdrawals, too, ranging from $5,000 to $15,000, each coinciding with some crisis or opportunity in Vanessa's life. All while I worked 30 hours a week, shelving books at the university library, and took out modest student loans to cover the gaps in my scholarship. Is there anything that can be done? I asked, already knowing the answer. Mr. Patterson removed his glasses, polishing them with a cloth as if the action might somehow clean away the discomfort of our conversation. From a banking perspective, Ms. Hayes, the withdrawals were legally authorized. However, he returned, his glasses to his face, his expression shifting slightly. Given the specific provisions of the trust and the pattern of withdrawals, there may be grounds for further investigation if you believe the trust has been mismanaged. An investigation? The word hung in the air between us. Yes, the bank can conduct an internal review of how the funds were used, particularly if there's evidence they weren't applied according to the trust's stated purposes. It's not a simple process, and I should warn you, it would likely create significant family conflict. Family conflict, the understatement of the century. I was 24 years old, just completed my undergraduate degree in financial management, with honors, and planning to start my MBA in the fall. An MBA I could no longer afford because my parents had systematically drained my educational trust to fund my sister's impulsive decisions. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was the one with the financial degree, yet I hadn't even thought to check on my trust fund until I needed it. I had trusted my parents implicitly, believed them when they said everything was taken care of. How would this investigation work? I asked, surprising myself with the question. A part of me wanted to simply walk away, to avoid the inevitable explosion that would come from challenging my parents' decisions. But a stronger voice, one that sounded remarkably like my grandmother's, urged me forward. We would examine each withdrawal against the provisions of the trust, Mr. Patterson explained. We would request documentation showing how the funds were used. If there's evidence of misappropriation, using the money for purposes explicitly not permitted by the trust, there could be legal consequences. Legal consequences? You mean? In cases of clear mismanagement, trustees can be required to restore funds to the trust. In extreme cases, there could be more serious repercussions. He hesitated. Ms. Hayes, I've been managing accounts at this bank for 27 years. Family financial disputes are among the most painful situations I encounter. I would urge you to consider speaking with your parents before initiating any formal investigation. I nodded absently, still staring at the transaction records. Each withdrawal told a story, not just of money taken, but of my future being sacrificed piece by piece for my sister's present comfort. I'll think about it, I said finally, gathering the papers and placing them carefully in my bag. As I stood to leave, Mr. Patterson offered one final thought. Whatever you decide, Ms. Hayes, remember that you have rights as the beneficiary of this trust. Your grandparents established it for your benefit, with specific intentions. Those intentions matter. Walking out of the bank into the bright spring afternoon, I felt a strange mix of devastation and determination. The future I had carefully planned now needed to be completely reimagined. Graduate school would have to be deferred, my timeline extended, my goals reconsidered. But beneath the practical concerns, a more profound question burned. How do you confront the people who raised you when you discover they've betrayed your trust? How do you look your family in the eye and ask them why they sacrificed your future to enable your sister's present? I didn't have answers yet, but as I walked to my modest used car, bought with my own savings while Vanessa drove her luxury SUV purchased with my trust fund, I made a decision. I would find the truth, however painful it might be. And somewhere in that truth, I would reclaim my future. The drive to my parents' suburban home felt longer than usual. Each mile gave me time to rehearse what I would say, how I would maintain my composure, how I would ask the questions that now burned inside me. By the time I pulled into their circular driveway, noting with fresh perspective the recent landscaping that probably cost thousands, I had cycled through anger, hurt, and a strange, calm resolve. My mother answered the door, surprise evident, on her face. Their sprawling Tudor-style home, with its manicured lawn and carefully curated interior, had always represented stability to me. Now I wondered what else it represented, and who had really paid for the recent renovations I could see throughout the first floor. "Olivia, we weren't expecting you today." She embraced me, the familiar scent of her expensive perfume now striking me differently. How many small withdrawals from my trust had gone toward maintaining her image of upper-middle-class perfection? "Is Dad home? I need to talk to both of you." My voice sounded distant, even to myself. "He's in his study." "Is everything all right?" "You look pale." Genuine concern crossed her face, which only made what I had to do more difficult. Despite everything, I knew my parents loved me. They just loved Vanessa's happiness more than my future. Dad emerged from his study, reading glasses perched on his nose, his expression brightening when he saw me. "There's my scholar. To what do we owe this surprise visit? Did you get news about your MBA applications?" The innocent question hit like a physical blow. "Actually, that's why I'm here. Can we sit down? I need to ask you both something important." The shift in the atmosphere was immediate. My father's smile faltered, and my mother's hands began fidgeting with her necklace, her tell when she was nervous. They knew. Some part of them had always known this day would come. We settled in the living room, me on one sofa, them together on the other. The physical division felt appropriate. "I met with Mr. Patterson at First National today," I began, watching their expressions carefully. "About my trust fund." My father cleared his throat, suddenly intensely interested in straightening the cuff of his shirt. My mother's fidgeting accelerated. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I needed to check the balance, to plan for graduate school expenses. I kept my voice level, determined not to let emotion derail this conversation. Imagine my surprise when I discovered that instead of the $340,000 that should be there, the balance is just over $12,000. The silence that followed was deafening. My parents exchanged glances, a married couple's silent communication that excluded me once again. "Olivia," my father finally said, adopting the reasonable tone he used when explaining complex matters to clients at his architectural firm. "Your mother and I have been meaning to talk to you about the trust fund. There have been some necessary adjustments to how those funds were allocated." "Adjustments," I repeated, the word hollow. "Is that what we're calling it when you systematically emptied a trust fund established for my education to fund Vanessa's lifestyle choices?" My mother flinched. "That's not fair, Olivia. The money was used for family needs." "Family needs?" I pulled the transaction records from my bag, placing them on the coffee table between us. A $45,000 destination wedding in Bali, a $38,000 down payment on a luxury vehicle, $120,000 for a beachfront condo. Which of these exactly were my educational needs, Mom? My father leaned forward, his face flushing. The trust allowed for funds to be used in the beneficiary's best interest. As a family, we share resources. Your sister needed... Don't, I interrupted, surprising all of us with my firmness. Don't tell me what Vanessa needed. Tell me why you decided her wants were more important than my future. It wasn't like that, my mother protested. We always intended to replace the money. Your father's business has had some setbacks, and your sister's wedding was an investment in connections that would benefit all of us. The condo is an appreciating asset. An asset in her name, I pointed out, purchased with my money. Our money, my father corrected, an edge entering his voice. While you were the beneficiary, your mother and I were the trustees. We made decisions we felt were appropriate at the time. I took a deep breath, fighting to maintain my composure. Mr. Patterson explained that the trust had specific provisions: educational expenses, medical emergencies, approved investments for me, not for family vacations disguised as networking opportunities or luxury vehicles, because Vanessa couldn't be bothered to drive carefully. My parents exchanged another glance, this one tinged with something new. Guilt, perhaps, or fear. My father was the first to recover. Olivia, what exactly are you planning to do with this information? His tone had shifted from defensive to cautious. That depends on you, I replied honestly. The bank can conduct an investigation into how the trust was managed. They can determine if funds were misappropriated, and if they were, there could be consequences. Legal consequences, including the requirement to restore the funds. My mother gasped. You would take legal action against your own parents, after everything we've done for you? The irony of her statement wasn't lost on me. I'm not here to threaten you. I'm here because I deserve an explanation, and I need to understand what happened to the money my grandparents set aside specifically for my future. My father stood abruptly, pacing the expensive Persian rug that had appeared last Christmas. This is absurd. We raised you, supported you, gave you everything. Everything except what was explicitly left for me, I countered. I worked through college. I took out loans. I drove a 10-year-old car while watching my sister get a new luxury vehicle purchased with my trust fund. So yes, Dad, I think I deserve answers. My mother's eyes filled with tears. We didn't think you'd notice, she whispered, the truth finally emerging. You were always so independent, so capable. Vanessa struggled more, needed more. We thought you'd be fine. The admission hung in the air between us. We didn't think you'd notice. Not, we planned to replace it, or, we had your best interests at heart, but the simple, devastating truth, they thought they wouldn't get caught. And now? I asked quietly. Now that I have noticed? My father stopped pacing, his shoulders slumping slightly. For the first time, he looked his age. We don't have the money to replace it, Olivia. The firm is just recovering from the economic downturn. The house is mortgaged. Your sister's condo is in her name, I finished for him. So I can't even claim partial ownership of that investment. He nodded, unable to meet my eyes. What about Vanessa? I asked. Does she even know where her lifestyle has been coming from? My parents exchanged another glance. This time, I could read it clearly. Vanessa had no idea. They had protected her from this truth, just as they had always protected her from consequences. I see, I said, gathering the bank statements and returning them to my bag. I'll need some time to think about what happens next. As I stood to leave, my mother caught my hand. Please, Olivia. We're still family. There must be another way to work this out. I looked down at her manicured fingers wrapped around mine. That's what I need to figure out, Mom. What family really means, and whether trust, once broken, can be rebuilt. Driving away from the house that had once represented security, I realized something important. The devastation I felt wasn't just about the money. It was about discovering that the family narrative I had accepted all my life was built on inequity. I had believed I was independent by choice. Now I understood I had been independent by necessity, because the family resources had always been allocated elsewhere. But in that painful recognition came an unexpected clarity. The self-reliance I had developed wasn't a consolation prize. It was my greatest asset. My sister, for all her material advantages, had never developed the resilience, work ethic, or problem-solving abilities I had been forced to cultivate. As I approached my apartment building, I made another decision. Whatever happened with the trust fund investigation, I would not let this betrayal define my future. I would find a way forward on my own terms, just as I always had. 3 days after confronting my parents, I still hadn't decided whether to pursue the bank's investigation. The emotional weight of the situation had settled into a dull ache that followed me everywhere. I had thrown myself into work at the financial consulting firm, where I'd secured an entry-level position after graduation, grateful for the distraction of spreadsheets and market analyses. The message from my grandmother's former attorney came unexpectedly. Howard Winters had retired 2 years ago, and I hadn't spoken to him since my grandmother's funeral. His email was brief but intriguing. Olivia, I've received some concerning information regarding your trust fund. Please call my office at your earliest convenience. This matter requires urgent attention. I called from my car during lunch break, curious how Mr. Winters had learned about the situation and what he could possibly contribute now that he was retired. Olivia, thank you for returning my call so promptly. His familiar voice greeted me, bringing back memories of holiday gatherings where he'd been a guest, having been not just my grandmother's attorney, but also her close friend. I apologize for the cryptic message, but this is a delicate matter. How did you know about my trust fund, Mr. Winters? I asked, skipping pleasantries. Did my parents contact you? There was a pause on the line. Actually, it was Mr. Patterson from First National. We've known each other for decades, and he was concerned about the situation. While bank policy prevented him from taking certain actions, his conscience prompted him to reach out to me unofficially. My grip tightened on the phone. Isn't that a breach of confidentiality? Technically, yes, Mr. Winters admitted. And he's risking quite a lot by doing so. But Eleanor, your grandmother, was more than a client to both of us. When Douglas Patterson saw the pattern of withdrawals and then met with you, he connected the dots. He felt obligated to honor Eleanor's intentions. I leaned back against the headrest, processing this information. So what exactly are you suggesting, Mr. Winters? Before I answer that, I need to tell you something about your trust fund that you may not know, something that wasn't in the standard documentation provided to beneficiaries. My interest sharpened. I'm listening. Eleanor was a brilliant woman, especially when it came to financial matters. She understood family dynamics better than most, having survived her own share of inheritance disputes. His voice took on a storytelling quality. When she established your trust fund, she included what we lawyers call a spendthrift provision, with a unique trigger clause. What does that mean? A standard spendthrift provision protects the trust assets from creditors of the beneficiary. But Eleanor's version went further. She included a clause that would automatically activate if there was evidence that the trustees, your parents, were misappropriating funds for purposes explicitly contrary to the stated intentions of the trust. A spark of hope flickered within me. And what happens when this clause is triggered? The management of the trust would transfer immediately to a secondary trustee, in this case, me, who would have the authority to conduct a full audit, recover misappropriated funds, and even pursue legal remedies if necessary. I sat up straighter. Are you saying you could actually recover the money? Potentially, yes. Your grandmother's clause was extraordinarily well crafted. It specified that any assets purchased using trust funds inappropriately could be subject to lien or forced sale to restore the trust. This would include property, vehicles, investments, anything purchased with misappropriated funds. My mind immediately went to Vanessa's condo, her luxury SUV, the expensive furniture and electronics that filled her home. Even if those assets are in someone else's name, like my sister's? Especially then, Mr. Winters confirmed. Eleanor was quite specific about preventing the diversion of funds to other family members. The provision includes language about transferred benefits and proxy recipients. She wanted to ensure your education and future were protected, Olivia, regardless of family pressures or favoritism. I sat in silence, absorbing the implications. My grandmother, whom I had always admired for her wisdom and foresight, had anticipated this very situation. She had built a safety net within the safety net, a protection not just from outside forces, but from potential exploitation within the family itself. Why wasn't I told about this provision before? I finally asked. These clauses are typically not disclosed to either the beneficiary or the trustees, Mr. Winters explained. Revealing such provisions could potentially undermine their effectiveness. If your parents had known about this trigger clause, they might have found more sophisticated ways to circumvent it. The realization that my grandmother had seen so clearly into the future both comforted and saddened me. Had she observed dynamics in our family that I had been too young to recognize? Had she witnessed favoritism toward Vanessa even then? What's the next step? I asked, making no effort to hide the determination in my voice. I've already begun the process to activate the trigger clause. Given the documentation Mr. Patterson shared with me, which I will obtain officially once I'm reinstated as trustee, there's clear evidence of misappropriation. Once the transition is complete, we can begin the recovery process. How long will that take? The transfer of trustee authority should be complete within 7 to 10 business days. The recovery process is more complex and could take months, particularly if your parents contest it. I considered this, weighing the inevitable family fallout against the recovery of my educational funding. Will my parents be notified before the transfer happens? They'll receive formal notification, yes. But they won't be able to prevent it. The language in the trust is binding, and Eleanor made certain it was legally unassailable. Another thought occurred to me. Mr. Winters, you're retired. Why would you take this on? There was a warm chuckle from the other end of the line. Your grandmother was one of my dearest friends, Olivia. We started our careers together, she as an accountant, me as a young attorney. She helped my family through some difficult financial times, never asking for recognition or repayment. When she asked me to serve as the secondary trustee for your fund, I promised her I would honor that commitment regardless of my professional status. Some promises transcend retirement. His words touched something deep within me. The realization that my grandmother's legacy extended beyond money to include the relationships she had cultivated and the loyalty she had inspired. Thank you, I said simply, knowing the words were inadequate. Don't thank me yet, he cautioned. This won't be easy, Olivia. Your parents will likely feel betrayed. Your sister may be devastated when she learns the source of her lifestyle. Family gatherings will be uncomfortable for some time. Are you prepared for that? I thought about my graduate school dreams, about the future I had planned, about the principle of the matter. My grandmother had worked hard to provide for my education, making thoughtful provisions to protect her gift. Honoring her intentions wasn't just about reclaiming money, it was about respecting her legacy. I'm prepared, I confirmed. Not because I want to punish anyone, but because I need to stand up for what's right. My grandmother believed in me. I can't let her down. She would be proud of you, Mr. Winters said softly. I'll contact you as soon as the trustee transfer is complete. In the meantime, prepare yourself. When your parents receive the notification, they'll likely contact you immediately. As I ended the call, I felt something I hadn't experienced since discovering the depleted trust fund, hope. Not just for the potential recovery of my educational funding, but for the validation that came with knowing my grandmother had seen my worth and taken extraordinary measures to protect my future. Whatever challenges lay ahead, I would face them with the knowledge that I wasn't alone. My grandmother's foresight was still guiding me, and her faith in me would give me the strength to navigate the difficult path forward. The notification letter arrived at my parents' home on a Tuesday. I know this because my phone began vibrating, with calls and texts at 9:47 that morning, just as I was preparing for an important client meeting. First my father, then my mother, then a surprising name, Vanessa. I silenced the phone, finished my presentation, and only when the meeting concluded did I listen to the voicemails, each progressively more frantic than the last. My father. Olivia, call me immediately. There's been some kind of mistake with the trust. We need to fix this before it escalates. My mother. Honey, please call back. Your father is beside himself. This lawyer is making outrageous claims about the trust fund. We need to talk. Vanessa. What the hell is going on, Olivia? Mom and Dad are freaking out about some trust fund thing and your name keeps coming up. Call me. I had expected anger, defensiveness, perhaps even pleas for understanding. What I hadn't anticipated was the pretense that this was all a misunderstanding or that I would somehow help them fix the situation. They still didn't understand that this wasn't a problem to be managed away with smooth talking and family pressure. This was a legal and ethical breach with real consequences. Rather than call them individually, I texted all three. I'll be at the house at 6:30 this evening. We can discuss everything then. Setting boundaries felt strange but necessary. For too long, I had responded to family emergencies according to their timetable. This time, I would approach the situation on my terms. When I arrived at my parents' house that evening, the tension was palpable before I even reached the door. Through the front window, I could see my father pacing the living room, hand raking through his hair, a gesture I recognized from childhood as his response to extreme stress. My mother sat rigidly on the sofa, back straight, hands clasped tightly in her lap. Vanessa stood by the fireplace, arms crossed defensively, looking confused and angry. It struck me that each of them was positioned exactly as their personalities would predict, my father in motion, always trying to find the next solution. My mother stationary but controlled, presenting composure despite inner turmoil. Vanessa centered in the room, unconsciously positioning herself as the focal point even in a crisis that wasn't about her. Or so she thought. Taking a deep breath, I rang the doorbell instead of using my key, another small assertion of the new dynamics between us. My father yanked the door open, his expression a mixture of relief and apprehension. Finally. Come in. We need to talk about this ridiculous letter. I stepped inside, maintaining a calm I didn't entirely feel. It's not ridiculous, Dad. It's the consequence of choices you and Mom made. Consequence? My mother's voice was tight. Olivia, this lawyer is threatening legal action against us, against your own parents. He's doing his job, I replied, taking a seat in the armchair, facing all three of them, protecting the trust as my grandmother intended. Vanessa stepped forward, her designer boots clicking on the hardwood floor. Would someone please explain what's going on? What trust? What lawyer? Why is everyone acting like this is Olivia's fault? My father and mother exchanged glances, that silent communication again, but this time I could read it clearly. They hadn't told Vanessa the truth. They had protected her, as always, from the consequences of their actions, and hers. Your sister's trust fund, my father began carefully. The one her grandmother established for her education. There's been a disagreement about how it was managed. Mismanagement is a more accurate term, I corrected quietly. The trustee is being changed. Because you and Mom used my educational funds to support Vanessa's lifestyle. My sister's perfectly manicured hand flew to her throat. What? That's not true. My lifestyle is supported by my job and by Mom and Dad helping out occasionally, like all parents do. The innocence in her voice was almost convincing. Almost. But I had seen the transaction records, matched the dates too perfectly to believe she had no knowledge of where the money for her emergencies had come from. Your wedding in Bali. I said, looking directly at her. $45,000. Your SUV after the fender bender, $38,000. The down payment on your beachfront condo, $120,000. All paid for with my trust fund, money Grandma specifically set aside for my education. Vanessa's face flushed, her eyes darting to our parents. Is this true? My mother's composure finally cracked. We were going to replace it. Your father's business was supposed to turn around, and we were going to put it all back before Olivia ever needed it. With what money? I asked, genuinely curious. Dad just told me last week that the firm is only now recovering. The house is mortgaged. Where exactly was this replacement money coming from? My father stopped pacing, his shoulders slumping in defeat. We hoped. You hoped I wouldn't notice. I finished for him. You gambled with my future on the chance that I wouldn't check my trust fund until after you'd somehow miraculously replaced hundreds of thousands of dollars. Vanessa sank onto the sofa, her face pale. I had no idea, she whispered. I mean, I knew you were helping with the wedding and the condo, but I thought... She trailed off, perhaps realizing for the first time that she had never truly questioned where all that support was coming from. It doesn't matter whether you knew or not, I said, not unkindly. What matters now is what happens next. My father's expression hardened. And what exactly is that? This lawyer, your grandmother's friend, is threatening to put liens on our property, force sales of assets. Do you understand what that would mean for this family? I understand exactly what it means, I replied steadily. It means facing the consequences of choices you made. Choices that prioritized Vanessa's wants over my future. Choices that betrayed not just me, but Grandma's explicit wishes. My mother leaned forward, tears welling in her eyes. Olivia, please. We're your parents. We made a mistake, a terrible mistake. But surely there's another way to resolve this. If you just tell Mr. Winters that you don't want to pursue this action... It's out of my hands now, I said, which wasn't entirely true, but felt necessary in that moment. The trustee transition has been initiated. Mr. Winters has a fiduciary duty to recover the misappropriated funds. There must be something you can do, my father insisted. Some way to stop this. I looked at each of them in turn. My father, desperate to find an escape route. My mother, still believing that emotional appeals could solve practical problems. And Vanessa, beginning to understand that the comfortable life she had enjoyed came at a significant cost to mine. I came here today not to stop the process, but to give you information, I said firmly. The recovery will focus on assets purchased with trust funds. That means Vanessa's condo, her vehicle, and potentially other large purchases if they can be traced back to trust withdrawals. Vanessa's eyes widened in panic. They can't take my condo. I have a life there, friends in the building. Where would I live? The irony of her concern didn't escape me. My future had been compromised for years to support her comfort, yet her first thought was for her own convenience rather than the wrong that had been done. The recovery process doesn't have to be devastating, I continued, ignoring her outburst. Mr. Winters has indicated there are options that could minimize disruption, refinancing the condo to extract the trust's portion, setting up payment plans, selling assets with the least emotional impact first. You've discussed this with him? My father asked sharply. You're actually working with him against your own family? His question hung in the air, heavy with accusation. For a moment, doubt crept in. Was I betraying my family? Was recovering what was rightfully mine worth the damage it would cause to these relationships? Then I remembered my grandmother's foresight, her determination to protect my future even from those who should have been its fiercest defenders. I remembered the years of working through college, taking on debt, deferring dreams while watching Vanessa's life unfold with effortless financial support. I'm not working against our family, I said finally. I'm standing up for what's right, for Grandma's wishes, for my future. Sometimes the hardest part of loving someone is holding them accountable. The room fell silent as the weight of my words settled around us. In that moment, I realized something fundamental had shifted. For the first time in my life, I wasn't the accommodating daughter, the one who understood, the one who adjusted. I was advocating for myself with the same determination I had always brought to my work and studies. And strangely, despite the tension and pain filling the room, I felt stronger than I ever had before. 2 weeks after the family confrontation, the recovery process was well underway. Mr. Winters had assumed trustee responsibilities and initiated a forensic accounting of every withdrawal from my trust fund over the past 6 years. The preliminary findings were even more alarming than I had anticipated. Beyond the major withdrawals you already identified, Mr. Winters explained during our meeting in his home office, where financial documents covered his large mahogany desk, we've uncovered numerous smaller transactions that were disguised as educational expenses but clearly weren't. I leaned forward, examining the spreadsheet he'd prepared. Like these payments to Coastal University? I never attended Coastal. Mr. Winters nodded grimly. Precisely. Those payments coincide with Vanessa's brief enrollment there before she dropped out 3 weeks into the semester. The trust paid for her tuition, which was never refunded despite her withdrawal from classes. My stomach tightened. So they were using my educational fund for her education too? I couldn't even find the words to describe the layered betrayal. That's actionable, Mr. Winters completed my thought. It demonstrates clear intent to misappropriate funds while attempting to mask the transactions as legitimate educational expenses. I stared at the growing list of misused funds, each line item telling its own story of deception. Family vacations classified as educational enrichment. Vanessa's cosmetic dental work filed as my medical expense. Monthly payments to a luxury apartment in the city that turned out to be where Vanessa had lived briefly with a boyfriend while finding herself after college. There's something else, Mr. Winters said, his tone shifting slightly as he pulled another document from his folder. Something I discovered while reviewing your grandmother's original documentation for the trust. He handed me a sealed envelope, yellowed with age, with my name written in my grandmother's distinctive handwriting. This was to be given to you when you completed your undergraduate degree. It was in the trust documentation, but your parents, as trustees, would have been responsible for delivering it. Obviously, they chose not to. With trembling fingers, I opened the envelope and unfolded the letter inside. My dearest Olivia, if you're reading this, you've completed your undergraduate studies. The first milestone in what I know will be a remarkable journey of learning and growth. I am so proud of the determined, thoughtful young woman you have become. With your degree in hand, you now have access to the second phase of your trust fund, the portion designated specifically for your graduate education or professional development. While the primary trust fund, $340,000, was established to support your undergraduate studies, this second fund contains an additional $275,000 for your continued education. Your parents, as trustees of the primary fund, have no access to this secondary account. I've arranged for it to be managed separately, with funds released directly to you upon completion of your undergraduate degree with a GPA of 3.5 or higher, a goal I have complete confidence you will achieve. Education has always been my passion, Olivia. As a woman who came of age in an era when female education was considered optional at best, I understand the profound power of knowledge and credentials. This gift represents my deepest hope for you, that you will never be limited by financial constraints in your pursuit of learning. Your brilliance, determination, and integrity have been evident since you were a small child. Use these gifts wisely, learn voraciously, grow intentionally, and know that whatever path you choose, I believe in you completely. With all my love, Grandma Eleanor. I reread the letter 3 times, my vision blurring with tears that I couldn't determine were from grief, relief, or some complex emotion that had no name. My grandmother had created a second trust, one my parents knew nothing about, or at least had no control over. One that remained intact, untouched by their mismanagement. "Is this real?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "There's really another trust fund?" Mr. Winters smiled, the first genuine smile I'd seen since this ordeal began. "Very real and fully funded. Your grandmother was extraordinarily prudent. She believed in creating safety nets beneath safety nets. When she added the trigger clause to your primary trust, she also established this secondary fund with different trustees and stricter controls." "But why didn't you tell me about this immediately, when we first spoke about the primary trust?" He leaned back in his chair, considering his response carefully. 2 reasons. First, I needed to confirm your academic standing. The release of the secondary trust was contingent on your completing your degree with honors, which you did. Quite impressively, I might add. I nodded, remembering the countless late nights studying, the weekends spent in the library while my friends went to parties, the dedication that had earned me my 382 GPA. And the second reason? I needed to see what you would do about the primary trust, he said simply. Whether you would stand up for yourself and for Eleanor's wishes, even when it was difficult, even when it meant confronting your family. Understanding dawned. "You were testing me?" "Not testing," he corrected gently. "Observing. Your grandmother believed character reveals itself most clearly under pressure. She wanted to ensure that whoever received her legacy understood its value and would protect it appropriately." Sat back, absorbing the implications. My grandmother hadn't just provided for my education. She had structured her gift in a way that would develop my character along with my intellect. The discovery of the misappropriated primary fund, painful as it was, had forced me to advocate for myself, to stand firm in my principles, to value my own future enough to fight for it. "The recovery of the primary trust will continue," Mr. Winters assured me. "Those funds were wrongfully diverted and should be restored. But regardless of how that process unfolds, your graduate education is secure." The following Saturday, I was surprised to find Vanessa waiting outside my apartment building when I returned from my morning run. She sat on the stone steps, looking uncharacteristically subdued in jeans and a simple sweater. A far cry from her usual designer outfits and carefully styled appearance. Her hair was pulled back in a ponytail, and her face was free of makeup, making her look younger and more vulnerable than I had seen her in years. "Can we talk?" she asked, standing as I approached. "Just us. No parents, no lawyers, no drama." I hesitated, simultaneously wary of a potential ambush and curious about what had prompted this unusual initiative from my sister, who typically avoided difficult conversations at all costs. "I brought coffee," she added, holding up a carrier with 2 cups. "And those almond croissants you like from Bellini's Bakery." The peace offering was unexpected. Vanessa rarely remembered my preferences, and the fact that she had gone to my favorite bakery across town rather than the trendy cafe near her condo suggested this wasn't an impulsive visit. "Come up," I said finally, leading her to my modest 2-bedroom apartment. I watched her take in my living space, the second-hand furniture carefully chosen for comfort and functionality, the bookshelves filled with financial texts and novels, the absence of the luxury items that filled her own home. I wondered if she was seeing it through new eyes, understanding for the first time that our different lifestyles weren't just about different tastes, but about dramatically different resources. We settled at my small kitchen table, the coffee and pastries between us like a buffer zone. For a moment, neither of us spoke, the silence filled with years of unaddressed imbalance. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," Vanessa began, her eyes fixed on her coffee cup. About everything, the trust fund, the money, all of it. I waited, giving her space to continue at her own pace. This was unfamiliar territory for both of us, genuine conversation without our parents' mediating presence. I went to the bank yesterday, she continued, her voice quieter. I looked at my own accounts, all of them. The mortgage on the condo, the car loan, everything. I wanted to understand exactly what my financial situation really is. She looked up, meeting my eyes directly. It's not good, Olivia. Not good at all. This admission must have cost her considerable pride. Vanessa had always maintained an aura of effortless success, presenting herself as someone who had everything figured out. What did you find? I asked gently. That I've been living in a financial fantasy, she said with a self-deprecating laugh that contained no real humor. The condo that I thought was mostly paid for? I have a massive mortgage. The car I thought Mom and Dad helped with as a gift? There's a loan in my name with barely any equity. My credit cards are maxed out. My savings account has less than $1,000. I frowned, confused. But your job at the boutique management firm pays far less than I've let everyone believe, she admitted. I've been maintaining appearances by relying on Mom and Dad's help, which I now realize was actually your money. She shook her head, genuine remorse crossing her features. The worst part is, I think on some level I knew. Not the specifics, not about your trust fund exactly, but I knew the math didn't add up. I just didn't want to look too closely. Her honesty surprised me. Vanessa had always been skilled at avoiding uncomfortable truths, redirecting blame, or changing the subject when confronted with consequences. This straightforward acknowledgement of her willful blindness represented growth I hadn't expected. Why are you telling me this now? I asked. She sighed, pushing her untouched croissant aside. Because I need to understand what happens next. Mr. Winters contacted me yesterday. He explained that my condo and car were purchased with misappropriated funds from your trust. He said we need to discuss remediation options. She made air quotes around the legal terminology. I'm scared, Olivia. Really scared. The condo is the only real asset I have, and the thought of losing it. Her voice trailed off, genuine fear evident in her expression. For the first time, I could see the precariousness of the life she had built. Or rather, the life that had been built for her with my resources. The foundation was crumbling, and she had no safety net of her own. I took a sip of my coffee, considering my response carefully. Mr. Winters mentioned several options. The simplest would be selling the assets and returning the funds to the trust. But there are alternatives. Refinancing to extract the trust's portion while you maintain ownership. Setting up a structured repayment plan. Even transferring partial ownership to the trust while you continue living there. Relief flickered across her face, followed quickly by shame. I don't deserve alternatives. What happened to you wasn't fair. If our situations were reversed. She didn't finish the thought, but she didn't need to. We both knew that Vanessa would likely not be sitting across from me offering options if I had benefited at her expense. This isn't about what either of us deserves, I said. It's about finding a path forward that honors Grandma's intentions while acknowledging the complicated reality we're in now. Vanessa nodded slowly, then reached into her bag and pulled out a folder. I want to show you something. I spent all night putting this together. She opened the folder to reveal a detailed financial plan, meticulously handwritten in the neat script I recognized from childhood when she used to label her elaborate art projects. Each page outlined a different aspect of her proposed solution. I've calculated what I can realistically pay back each month based on my actual income, she explained, pointing to the carefully constructed budget. I've identified expenses I can cut immediately. The housekeeping service, the meal delivery program, the premium cable package. I'm going to sell the designer clothes and bags I've accumulated. I've even reached out to a real estate agent about renting the second bedroom in my condo to generate additional income. I scanned the pages, genuinely impressed by the thoroughness of her plan. Vanessa had never shown much interest in financial management before, preferring to leave such mundane concerns to others while she focused on more exciting aspects of life. You did all this yourself? I couldn't keep the surprise from my voice. A flush crept up her neck. I know what you're thinking. Vanessa Hayes? Actually taking responsibility? Making a budget? It's like seeing a unicorn. Her attempt at self-deprecating humor couldn't mask the genuine effort evident in her work. But yes, I did. No help from mom and dad, no accountant, just me and about a dozen financial websites and YouTube tutorials on basic budgeting. It's impressive, I acknowledged sincerely, and it shows real commitment to making things right. That's what I want, Liv, she said earnestly, using my childhood nickname for the first time in years. I know I can't undo what happened. I can't give you back the years you worked multiple jobs while I was living it up on your dime. But I can take responsibility now. I can be part of the solution instead of continuing to be part of the problem. There was a vulnerability in her expression that I hadn't seen since we were children, before our paths diverged so dramatically, before she became the favored daughter and I became the self-sufficient one. It reminded me that beneath the superficial differences, the entitlement and the privileges, there remained the sister who had once built blanket forts with me during thunderstorms and defended me fiercely against neighborhood bullies. This is a good start, I said, tapping her financial plan. I'll share it with Mr. Winters. I think he'll be impressed by your initiative. Thank you, she said, relief evident in her voice. But there's one more thing. She hesitated, seeming to gather her courage. I want to make amends beyond just the money. I've been thinking about how I can support you in ways that actually matter. What do you mean? Your graduate school plans, she said. I know they've been disrupted by all of this. I want to help you get back on track. Not financially, since I'm obviously in no position to help there, but practically. Maybe I could help with research for your applications, or proofread your essays, or... She gestured vaguely, clearly, uncertain about what practical assistance might actually look like, but genuine in her desire to offer it. The awkward offer touched me more deeply than a grand gesture would have. Vanessa was trying, in her limited way, to be the kind of sister she had never been before. One who contributed rather than just consumed, who supported rather than competed. I'd appreciate that, I said, surprising both of us with my acceptance. I'm planning to submit applications for next fall. Having another set of eyes on my essays would be helpful. Her smile, relieved, grateful, hopeful, transformed her face, reminding me of the bright-eyed girl she had been before entitlement hardened her features into something more calculating and less genuine. I'd like that, she said softly. And, Olivia, I really am sorry. Not just because I got caught or because there are consequences, but because I should have been a better sister all along. You deserved that. As she left my apartment an hour later, I felt something unexpected. Not the satisfaction of seeing her humbled or the vindication of her apology, but rather a cautious hope that perhaps from this painful unraveling of deception might emerge a more authentic relationship, one based on mutual respect rather than assigned family roles. A month into the recovery process, my parents requested a formal meeting with Mr. Winters and me at his office. The email from my father was uncharacteristically humble, with none of the defensive tone or implied accusations that had characterized our previous interactions. We've been doing some serious reflection, he wrote. We'd like to discuss a proposal for making amends. I approached the meeting with cautious optimism, still wary of manipulation but hopeful that my parents had genuinely begun to understand the gravity of their actions. When I arrived at Mr. Winter's office, a warm, book-lined space that reflected his decades of careful practice. My parents were already seated in the leather chairs facing his desk. They looked different somehow, diminished, as if the weight of accountability had physically compressed them. My mother reached for my hand as I took the seat beside her. I let her take it briefly before gently withdrawing to place my portfolio on my lap, establishing a subtle but important boundary. "Thank you for agreeing to meet," my father began, his voice lacking its usual authoritative resonance. "Catherine and I have spent the past weeks taking a hard look at our actions and their impact. What we did was wrong, legally, ethically, and as parents. There's no justification for betraying your trust or undermining your grandmother's explicit wishes." The straightforward admission caught me off guard. I had expected qualifications, contextualizing, subtle attempts to distribute responsibility. This unambiguous acknowledgement of wrongdoing represented a significant shift. "We've prepared a comprehensive proposal for rectifying the situation," my mother added, sliding a bound document across to Mr. Winters. "We've consulted with our own financial advisor and attorney to ensure it's both feasible and legally sound." Mr. Winters reviewed the document carefully, his expression remaining neutral as he turned each page. After several minutes, he passed it to me. "I believe you'll find this worth considering, Olivia." The proposal outlined a structured restoration plan far more comprehensive than anything Mr. Winters had suggested. My parents had listed all their assets, including their home, my father's partnership share in his architectural firm, their investment accounts, and even personal items of significant value. They proposed liquidating non-essential assets immediately, restructuring their mortgage to extract equity, and establishing a binding repayment schedule for the remaining balance. Most surprisingly, they had included a section titled Accountability Measures, which proposed regular financial disclosure reports to both me and Mr. Winters, transfer of all remaining trustee responsibilities to Mr. Winters permanently, and family counseling to address the patterns of favoritism and inequity that contributed to our poor decisions. "You're offering to sell your home?" I asked, noting that it was listed among the assets to be liquidated within 6 months. My father nodded. "The house is far larger than we need, especially now. We've already met with a realtor to discuss listing it next month. The market in our neighborhood is strong, and the equity should cover a significant portion of what we owe to your trust." "Where will you live?" The practical question emerged before I could consider whether their housing situation should be my concern. "We found a townhouse near downtown," my mother replied. "It's smaller, but more than adequate, and the location will actually reduce your father's commute to the firm." I continued reading, noting the thoroughness of their plan. They had even included contingency provisions for potential market downturns or health emergencies that might affect their repayment capacity. The level of detail suggested they had indeed spent considerable time developing this proposal. "What prompted this?" I asked finally, looking up from the document. 3 weeks ago, you were still suggesting that we find a way to make this go away. Now you're voluntarily offering to liquidate assets beyond what would likely be required through legal remedies." My parents exchanged a glance that contained none of their usual silent communication tactics, no encoded messages designed to present a united front. Instead, I saw simple, pained acknowledgement pass between them. "We had a long conversation with Vanessa," my father said quietly. "She shared the financial plan she created, her commitment to taking responsibility. She told us she was doing it not because of legal pressure, but because it was right, because rebuilding her relationship with you mattered more than any material possession. Our daughter, our younger daughter, showed more maturity and integrity than we had," my mother continued, her voice thick with emotion. "It forced us to confront the example we've been setting, the values we've been modeling, and we were ashamed of what we saw." My father leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly. We also spoke with Pastor Michaels. You remember him from the church we attended when you were growing up. We've been meeting with him weekly, examining the choices we've made, the patterns we've established in our family. He helped us see how our behaviors have caused real harm, not just financially, but emotionally. The mention of spiritual counsel surprised me. My parents had always approached religion as a social obligation rather than a moral framework. That they would voluntarily seek guidance from a pastor suggested a depth of reflection I hadn't anticipated. The proposal contains more than just financial restitution, Mr. Winters noted, drawing my attention to the final section of the document. They've outlined steps for rebuilding trust and addressing the underlying family dynamics. I turned to the pages he indicated, where my parents had detailed their commitment to family therapy, regular transparency about financial matters, and explicit acknowledgement of the favoritism that had characterized their parenting for decades. "We know money alone can't fix what we've broken," my mother said softly. "Trust takes years to build and moments to destroy. We're prepared for a long process of rebuilding, if you're willing to give us that opportunity." The humility in her voice was genuine, lacking the emotional manipulation I had grown adept at recognizing. This wasn't an attempt to escape consequences, but a recognition that consequences were necessary and deserved. "What about Vanessa?" I asked. "How does she fit into this plan?" "She's developing her own path to making amends," my father explained. "We've made it clear that while we'll support her emotional growth, we won't be providing further financial assistance. She needs to stand on her own feet, just as you've been doing all along." Mr. Winters cleared his throat gently. "From a legal perspective, this proposal actually exceeds what we could likely achieve through formal proceedings. It addresses not just the financial misappropriation, but the breach of fiduciary duty in a comprehensive way." He turned to me. "Of course, the decision is entirely yours, Olivia. You have every right to proceed with the formal recovery process if you prefer." I studied my parents' faces, searching for signs of the subtle manipulation tactics I had grown up navigating. Instead, I saw only weary acceptance, the expressions of people who had finally stopped running from their own actions. "I need some time to think about this," I said finally. "Of course," my father agreed immediately. "Take all the time you need. The offer stands regardless." As the meeting concluded, my mother hesitated, then spoke quietly. "Whatever you decide about the proposal, we want you to know something. We are deeply, profoundly sorry. Not just for the financial betrayal, but for every time we failed to see your worth, every time we prioritized Vanessa's wants over your needs, every time we took your strength for granted instead of nurturing it." Her voice broke. "You deserved better from us. You always did." Walking out of that meeting, I felt a complex mixture of emotions I couldn't immediately untangle. Vindication, certainly. My parents had finally acknowledged the patterns I had, observed but doubted for years. Relief that a resolution might be possible without protracted legal proceedings. Caution born from years of seeing grand parental promises dissipate when convenience demanded. But beneath these expected reactions stirred something unfamiliar. A tentative hope that perhaps true change was possible, not just in financial arrangements, but in the fundamental dynamics that had shaped our family for as long as I could remember. After the meeting with my parents, I spent a week carefully evaluating their proposal. By day, I maintained my focus at work, analyzing investment opportunities and market trends for our clients with my characteristic thoroughness. By night, I reviewed financial documents, consulted with Mr. Winters about legal implications, and grappled with the more complex emotional dimensions of my choice. On the 7th evening, I found myself walking along the river that cut through downtown, seeking clarity in the rhythm of moving water and the perspective of open space. The night was cool but clear, the first stars appearing above the city skyline as twilight deepened into evening. "Mind if I join you?" I turned to find Professor Elaine Chen approaching along the riverfront path. She had been my faculty advisor throughout my undergraduate studies, a brilliant economist whose clear-eyed perspective and unwavering integrity had shaped my own professional ethics. In the months since graduation, we had maintained a mentoring relationship, meeting occasionally for coffee to discuss my career development. "Professor Chen," I greeted her with genuine pleasure. "What brings you to the riverfront?" "Same as you, I imagine," she replied with a smile, falling into step beside me. "Seeking perspective. The office walls close in after a while." She studied my expression briefly. "You look preoccupied. Work challenges?" "Life challenges," I admitted. Our relationship had always been characterized by honesty, and I found myself wanting her perspective on my situation. "Do you have a few minutes?" I could use an objective viewpoint on something important. We settled on a bench overlooking the water, and I explained the situation: the discovery of the depleted trust fund, my grandmother's secondary trust, my sister's efforts at amends, and now my parents' comprehensive proposal for restitution. Professor Chen listened attentively, asking occasional clarifying questions but offering no immediate judgment. When I finished, she remained silent for a long moment, watching the patterns of moonlight playing across the river's surface. "What's the core question you're struggling with?" she finally asked. "Is it whether their offer is financially adequate? Or something deeper?" I considered her question carefully. "The financial aspects are actually straightforward. Their proposal is fair, possibly more than fair. Mr. Winters believes it represents appropriate restitution for the misappropriated funds. Then what's holding you back from accepting?" "Trust," I said simply. "Can I trust that this represents genuine change? Or is it just another sophisticated strategy to manage an uncomfortable situation?" Throughout my childhood, my parents were masters at making grand gestures when backed into corners, only to revert to old patterns once the pressure eased. Professor Chen nodded thoughtfully. "Trust is rational when based on consistent evidence of trustworthiness. Given their historical patterns, your hesitation makes sense." She turned slightly to face me directly. "But I'm curious. What outcome are you hoping for from this situation? What would resolution look like for you?" The question caught me off guard. I had been so focused on evaluating their proposal against what had been taken that I hadn't fully articulated what I wanted the future to look like. I began, then paused to organize my thoughts. "I want acknowledgement of the patterns that led to this situation. I want genuine change in how our family functions. I want relationships based on mutual respect rather than assigned roles and expectations." "And do you believe those things are possible?" I sighed. "That's what I'm struggling with. People can change. I believe that. But substantial change requires genuine insight, consistent effort, and usually some form of accountability structure. Their proposal includes family therapy and ongoing financial transparency," Professor Chen noted. "Those could serve as accountability mechanisms." "True. But I've seen promises of change before." She was quiet for a moment, considering. "In economics, we often discuss something called credible commitment devices, mechanisms that make it difficult or costly for someone to renege on their promises. What would make their commitment to change credible to you?" The concept resonated immediately. My parents' proposal included financial restitution, but lacked specific mechanisms to ensure the relational changes they promised would actually materialize and persist. "Regular family therapy with progress reports," I said, thinking aloud. "Defined benchmarks for rebuilding trust. Maybe even a neutral third party to help mediate family dynamics initially." Professor Chen nodded encouragingly. "Those sound like reasonable requirements. Particularly given the history, having objective measures rather than subjective assurances seems appropriate." But is it fair to impose such structured requirements on family relationships? I questioned. It feels so transactional. Fairness is an interesting concept in this context, she replied thoughtfully. Is it fair that you've had to develop such vigilance in your family relationships? Is it fair that you've had to work multiple jobs while watching resources that were explicitly designated for you being diverted elsewhere? Relationships are inherently reciprocal. When trust has been significantly damaged, creating clear parameters for rebuilding it isn't transactional. It's protective. Her framing shifted something in my perspective. I had been viewing my hesitation as potentially punitive or unforgiving, when in reality, it represented a reasonable expectation for demonstrable change before extending renewed trust. I'm also struck by something else in what you've shared. Professor Chen continued, despite everything, you're still considering reconciliation. That speaks to tremendous strength of character and capacity for forgiveness. Not blind forgiveness that enables continued harmful behavior, but the kind that creates possibility for genuine transformation. My grandmother modeled that kind of strength, I said quietly. She experienced significant betrayal in her own life but never became bitter. She focused on creating security and opportunity rather than seeking retribution. It seems her legacy to you extends far beyond financial resources, Professor Chen observed. She gave you a model for responding to injustice with wisdom rather than simply reaction. We sat in companionable silence for several minutes, watching the river flow, each current catching moonlight before disappearing into shadow. You know, Professor Chen said finally, one of the most valuable skills in both economics and life is knowing how to evaluate acceptable risk. No decision comes with absolute certainty. There's always the possibility of loss. The question is whether the potential benefit justifies the risk. And how do you calculate that in a situation like this? You consider the potential outcomes, she explained. If you accept their proposal with additional accountability measures and they follow through, you gain financial restitution and potentially healthier family relationships. If they don't follow through, you've still secured the financial recovery and learned valuable information about the feasibility of relational healing. And if I reject their proposal and proceed with formal legal remedies, you likely achieve similar financial recovery, but with higher emotional and relationship costs. The possibility of relational healing becomes more remote. Her analysis clarified the stakes with characteristic precision. The financial outcome might be similar either way, but the potential for genuine family reconciliation existed only if I was willing to extend conditional trust. Trust circumscribed by clear expectations and accountability measures. Thank you, I said sincerely. You've helped me see the decision more clearly. She smiled. That's what good advisors do. They don't tell you what to choose, but they help you see the choice more accurately. She stood, gathering her light, jacket around her as the evening air cooled further. Whatever you decide, Olivia, remember that your worth has never been determined by how others value you. Your grandmother saw your true potential. So do I. The question now is whether your family can finally recognize what has been evident to others all along. As I watched her walk away, her words lingered with particular resonance. Throughout my life, I had internalized the message that I mattered less, deserved less, needed less. I had constructed an identity around being self-sufficient out of necessity, telling myself it was a strength when in reality it had been an adaptation to systematic neglect. The next morning, I scheduled a meeting with my parents and Mr. Winters to discuss modifications to their proposal. I would accept their financial restitution plan, but with additional provisions focused on rebuilding trust through consistent, measurable actions rather than promises alone. This wasn't about punishing them or establishing control. It was about creating the conditions for genuine healing, for all of us. It was about transforming a painful revelation of betrayal into an opportunity for authentic relationship built on mutual respect rather than entrenched patterns. As I prepared my counter-proposal, I realized that my grandmother's greatest gift hadn't been the financial resources she provided, valuable as they were. It had been the model she offered of standing firmly in one's worth while remaining open to restoration rather than retribution. The conference room at Mr. Winter's office felt different this time, less like a battleground and more like neutral territory where genuine negotiation might occur. I arrived early, reviewing my notes and centering myself for what would undoubtedly be a pivotal conversation. When my parents entered, I noticed subtle changes in their demeanor. My father's usual commanding presence had mellowed into something more thoughtful. My mother's carefully maintained facade of perfection had softened, her designer outfit replaced by simpler attire, her face showing the natural signs of stress and sleepless nights she would typically have concealed. "Thank you for meeting with us," my father said, his voice lacking its usual authoritative edge. "We appreciate your willingness to consider our proposal." Mr. Winters took his seat at the head of the table, his expression professional, but kind. "Olivia has prepared a response to your offer. I believe it represents a thoughtful path forward. I distributed copies of my counterproposal, a comprehensive document I had spent the weekend developing with input from both Mr. Winters and Professor Chen, whom I had asked to review the financial aspects given her expertise in behavioral economics. "I've considered your offer carefully," I began, meeting their eyes directly. "The financial restoration plan you've outlined is fair and comprehensive. I'm prepared to accept it with the modifications outlined in Section 1. My parents turned to the relevant pages, reviewing the adjustments I had proposed, mainly technical changes to the liquidation timeline and repayment structure, designed to ensure sustainable compliance rather than setting unrealistic deadlines that might later require renegotiation. "These modifications seem reasonable," my father said after reading through the section. "They actually address some concerns we had about potential market fluctuations affecting the sale of certain assets. The second section is where my counterproposal differs significantly from your original offer," I continued, keeping my voice even and professional. "While financial restitution is necessary, it doesn't address the underlying patterns that led to this situation." My mother tensed visibly, her fingers tightening around her pen. "You mean our favoritism toward Vanessa?" Her direct acknowledgement surprised me. "Yes, but it's more complex than that. It's about a family system where roles were assigned and reinforced over decades, where my independence was used to justify neglect rather than being recognized as an adaptation to it, where Vanessa's dependency was enabled rather than addressed." My father nodded slowly, his expression pained but attentive. "You're right. These patterns go back further than the financial mismanagement." I turned to the second section of my document, titled Relational Restoration Framework. "I'm proposing a structured approach to rebuilding trust and establishing healthier family dynamics," I explained. "It includes regular family therapy with a specialist in family systems, but goes beyond that to establish clear expectations and accountability measures." My parents exchanged a glance before my father spoke. "When you say accountability measures, I mean concrete ways to demonstrate commitment to change," I clarified. "For example, quarterly family meetings to discuss financial decisions transparently, regular check-ins with specific focus on communication patterns, documentation of progress in therapy. Essentially, credible commitment mechanisms that make it more difficult to revert to established patterns once the immediate crisis has passed." I watched their reactions carefully, prepared for defensiveness or resistance. Instead, my mother surprised me by reaching for the document with a thoughtful expression. "This reminds me of the recovery plan my brother implemented after his struggle with addiction," she said quietly. "The structured approach, the clear benchmarks, the emphasis on demonstrated change rather than promises. It's actually quite similar." I hadn't known my mother had made this connection, though I was aware of my uncle's sobriety journey. "The parallels are intentional," I acknowledged. Unhealthy family dynamics share certain characteristics with addiction. They're persistent, they involve denial, they require systematic intervention. This framework borrows from recovery models because they've proven effective for creating lasting change. My father studied the document more closely. Some of these requirements seem intensive: weekly family therapy for 6 months, then bi-weekly for another 6. Monthly family meetings with facilitated discussions, written reflections, and progress assessments. He looked up. This represents a significant commitment. Yes, I agreed simply, because rebuilding what's been damaged requires significant commitment. If that feels excessive, it may indicate we have different understandings of what's been broken and what's needed to repair it. The directness of my statement hung in the air for a moment. Then, surprisingly, my father nodded. No, it's not excessive. It's proportionate. He hesitated, showing rare vulnerability. I wonder if we're capable of the level of change this would require. His honesty touched something in me, the recognition that beneath the betrayal and manipulation lay real human limitation and fear. That's a fair question, I said more gently, and an important one to consider before committing to this path. This framework isn't designed to be punitive. It's designed to create the conditions where genuine change and healing become possible. But it will be demanding. It will require sustained effort and uncomfortable growth from all of us. Including you? My mother asked, a hint of her old defensiveness emerging. Especially me, I acknowledged readily. I have my own patterns to address, walls I've built, assumptions I've made, ways I've defined myself in opposition to family, dynamics rather than independently of them. Healthy family relationships require everyone's participation in the healing process. My mother's defenses seemed to soften at my willingness to acknowledge my own work in the process. Have you shown this to Vanessa? She asked. Not yet. If we reach agreement on this framework, I'd propose a separate conversation with her to discuss her role in the family restoration process. Her situation differs from yours, and her responsibilities within this framework would reflect that difference. Mr. Winters, who had remained silent during our exchange, now spoke up. I want to emphasize something important here. This counter-proposal reflects remarkable maturity and foresight. Many in Olivia's position would focus exclusively on financial restitution or even punitive measures. Instead, she's created a pathway toward healing that acknowledges the complexity of family dynamics while establishing necessary boundaries. My father leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. May we have some time to review this more thoroughly? There's a lot to process here. Of course, I said. Take whatever time you need. This isn't a decision to rush. Could we reconvene next week? My mother suggested. We'd like to consult with our therapist as well. We've been seeing someone individually since this all began, and I think her perspective would be valuable. The revelation that my parents had already sought professional help independently, not just as a show for me or Mr. Winters, but as part of their own process, was unexpected and encouraging. That sounds reasonable, I agreed. Next Monday? As we confirmed the details for our follow-up meeting, I felt a subtle shift in the atmosphere, a tentative movement from adversarial positioning toward collaborative problem-solving. It wasn't reconciliation yet, not by any measure, but it was the beginning of a path that might eventually lead there. After my parents left, Mr. Winters turned to me with an appraising look. You know, in 40 years of legal practice, I've seen countless family disputes over financial matters. Most end in one of two ways, either complete estrangement or superficial reconciliation that masks continuing dysfunction. What you're attempting here is remarkably rare. I'm not sure it will work, I admitted. There's a lot of history to overcome. True, he acknowledged. But I'm reminded of something your grandmother once told me when we were discussing a particularly complex estate case. She said, "The measure of success isn't whether you eliminate all problems. It's whether you create conditions where healing becomes possible. You've done that here regardless of what happens next." As I gathered my documents to leave, I realized that something fundamental had shifted within me over these difficult weeks. I had entered this situation feeling victimized, justifiably so, by my parents' betrayal. But somewhere along the way, I had moved from passive reaction to active creation, designing a potential future rather than simply responding to past injustices. Walking to my car, I recalled a quote from a philosophy course I had taken during my undergraduate studies. "Between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space lies our freedom and power to choose our response." The discovery of my depleted trust fund had been the stimulus. My counter-proposal represented my chosen response, not denial, not vengeful retaliation, not doormat acceptance, but a thoughtful framework for accountability and potential healing. Whatever my parents decided next week, I had already reclaimed. Something more valuable than money: the power to define the terms of my own relationships based on self-respect and clear boundaries rather than assigned family roles. In that realization lay a different kind of trust fund, one that could never be depleted because it existed within me, rather than in any external account. 3 days after presenting my counter-proposal, I received an unexpected email from Dr. Rebecca Lindstrom, the therapist my parents had mentioned consulting. "Ms. Hayes," she wrote, "your parents have given me permission to contact you directly. If you're amenable, I'd like to meet with you individually before your next family meeting. Your perspective would be valuable to my understanding of the dynamics at play." The request surprised me. I had assumed my parents were seeking individual support, not family therapy. At least not yet. After some consideration, I agreed to the meeting, curious about this professional who had apparently gained my parents' trust during such a vulnerable period. Dr. Lindstrom's office was in a converted Victorian home near the university campus, her practice occupying the entire second floor. The space managed to be simultaneously professional and comforting, thoughtfully arranged with comfortable seating, soft lighting, and an absence of the sterile clinical atmosphere I had half expected. The therapist herself matched her environment, a woman in her early 60s with silver-streaked dark hair and an attentive presence that conveyed both warmth and boundaries. She welcomed me with a firm handshake and direct eye contact that somehow communicated respect rather than confrontation. "Thank you for agreeing to meet, Olivia," she said as we settled into comfortable chairs facing each other. "I want to be transparent about my role here. While your parents initially sought my help individually, they've indicated their interest in my potentially serving as the family systems therapist outlined in your counterproposal, should all parties agree." I nodded, appreciating her straightforwardness. "That makes sense of why you wanted to meet with me." "Exactly. I need to understand all perspectives before determining if I'm the right fit for this complex situation." She leaned forward slightly. "I should clarify that this meeting isn't therapy. I haven't been retained as your therapist, so this is more accurately described as a consultation. You're free to share or withhold whatever feels appropriate, and nothing you say will be shared directly with your parents." Her professional clarity was reassuring. "What would you like to know?" "I've heard your parents' perspective on what happened with your trust fund and the broader family dynamics. I'd value hearing yours as well." She settled back in her chair, her posture attentive but unhurried, creating space for my response without pressure. I had explained the situation so many times recently, to Mr. Winters, to Professor Chen in my own documentation, that I expected the narrative to flow easily. Instead, I found myself hesitating, suddenly aware that this retelling would shape Dr. Lindstrom's understanding of our family in ways that might influence her approach to potential therapy. "Take your time," she said, noticing my pause. "Complex relationships rarely resolve themselves into simple narratives. Something about Her patience and insight encouraged me to start at a different point than I had with others. I think to understand what happened with the trust fund, you need to understand how our family has always operated, I began. The roles were established early. Vanessa as the one who needed support, protection, guidance, me as the one who was fine on my own. For the next 40 minutes, I traced the patterns that had defined our family, not just the financial betrayal, but the years of subtle messages that had shaped both Vanessa's entitlement and my self-reliance. I described holidays where her preferences dictated plans, school events where my achievements were expected while hers were celebrated, the gradual realization that I would need to create my own support systems rather than relying on family resources that were consistently directed elsewhere. Dr. Lindstrom listened attentively, asking occasional clarifying questions that demonstrated her engagement without interrupting my flow. Her queries were thoughtful and often unexpected, focusing not just on what had happened, but on how I had interpreted and responded to these dynamics over time. You've described the impact of these patterns on your relationship with your parents, she noted when I paused. I'm curious about how they've affected your relationship with Vanessa over the years. The question prompted me to consider something I hadn't fully articulated before. It's complicated, I admitted. There's love there, but it's been overshadowed by resentment and distance. I never blamed Vanessa for our parents' choices, at least not consciously, but I did withdraw from her. It was easier than constantly confronting the disparity in how we were treated. And now, since the trust fund revelations? Surprisingly, there's been a shift. Her response when she learned about the source of her financial support was unexpectedly reflective. She's made genuine efforts to take responsibility and make amends. I described Vanessa's financial plan, her offer of practical support for my graduate school applications. It's tentative, but it feels like the first authentic connection we've had in years. Dr. Lindstrom nodded thoughtfully. Family systems often resist change. They develop equilibrium, even when that balance is unhealthy. What you're describing suggests a significant disruption to that system, creating the potential for new patterns to emerge. That's my hope with the counter-proposal, I acknowledged. Not just recovering the money, but addressing the underlying dynamics that made the financial betrayal possible in the first place. She studied me for a moment. May I share an observation? Throughout our conversation, you've demonstrated remarkable psychological insight and emotional intelligence. You've analyzed complex family patterns with unusual clarity and proposed solutions that balance accountability with opportunity for growth. These are not typical capabilities for someone your age, particularly when navigating such personal territory. Her observation caught me off guard. I've had to develop these skills out of necessity, I said after a moment. When you grow up having to understand subtle power dynamics just to navigate daily life, you become attuned to patterns others might miss. That's often true, she agreed. Adversity can develop exceptional strengths. But there's something more here. You've not only recognized these patterns but developed a framework for addressing them that shows sophisticated understanding of how sustainable change occurs. That reflects remarkable resilience and wisdom. Her words stirred something unexpected within me, a sense of recognition I had rarely experienced. Throughout my life, my capabilities had been acknowledged in academic and professional contexts, but within my family, they had been either taken for granted or viewed as evidence that I needed less support than Vanessa. To have my approach to this painful situation recognized as exceptional rather than expected felt strangely validating. Your grandmother, Dr. Lindstrom continued thoughtfully, seems to have recognized these qualities in you. Her provisions, not just the financial resources but the protective mechanisms she established, suggest she saw your potential and was determined to safeguard it. She was the one person who consistently saw me clearly, I agreed, feeling the familiar ache of missing her wisdom and guidance. Even when I was young, she treated me not just with affection, but with a kind of respect that acknowledged my capabilities without exploiting them. It strikes me that her legacy extends far beyond the financial trust she established, Dr. Lindstrom observed. She provided a model of foresight, integrity, and principled compassion that you've internalized. In many ways, you're approaching this situation as she might have, with clear boundaries and expectations, yes, but also with an open door to reconciliation when balanced with appropriate accountability. Her insight resonated deeply. Throughout this ordeal, I had consciously drawn strength from my grandmother's example, but I hadn't fully recognized how profoundly her influence had shaped my response. The framework I had created for family healing reflected her values, the belief that relationships matter, that integrity is non-negotiable, that forgiveness is possible but must be built on honesty and changed behavior. I would be honored to work with your family through this process, Dr. Lindstrom said as our meeting drew to a close. But I want to acknowledge something important. While I believe I can offer valuable guidance, you are already demonstrating the leadership necessary to transform these family dynamics. My role would be to facilitate and support a process you've already thoughtfully designed. As I left her office, her words echoed in my mind. Throughout my life, I had developed strength, independence, and resilience out of necessity, adaptations, to family dynamics that had often left me feeling unseen and unsupported. Now, those same qualities were being recognized not as compensatory mechanisms, but as leadership assets that could guide my family toward healthier patterns. Perhaps that was my grandmother's deepest gift, not just financial resources or protective, legal measures, but the recognition of my inherent capabilities and the confidence to nurture them even when others did not. She had seen in me what I was only now beginning to fully claim: the capacity not just to survive within challenging family dynamics, but to transform them through principled leadership and compassionate boundaries. The following Monday arrived with an unexpected sense of calm determination rather than the anxiety I had anticipated. When I entered Mr. Winter's conference room for our scheduled meeting, I found my parents already seated, each with a copy of my counter-proposal before them, pages now marked with sticky notes and handwritten annotations that suggested thorough consideration. My father looked up as I took my seat, his expression serious but noticeably less guarded than in our previous interactions. "Olivia, before we begin the formal discussion, there's something I'd like to say." He glanced at my mother, who nodded encouragingly. "We've spent the past week reviewing your counter-proposal, discussing it with Dr. Lindstrom, and doing some deep reflection. What you've created here isn't just a response to our offer. It's a comprehensive framework for healing that addresses issues we've avoided confronting for decades." My mother leaned forward slightly. "We've decided to accept your counter-proposal in its entirety, without modifications or conditions." Their unequivocal acceptance caught me off guard. I had expected negotiation, perhaps resistance to certain accountability measures, or attempts to soften some of the more demanding aspects of the relational restoration framework. "You're accepting everything?" I clarified, my surprise evident. "The modified financial restitution schedule, the family therapy commitment, the transparency mechanisms, all of it?" My father nodded firmly. "All of it. Not reluctantly or conditionally, but with full recognition that this is what healing requires." Mr. Winters, seated at the head of the table, raised an eyebrow slightly. "This is quite definitive. May I ask what led to such comprehensive acceptance?" My mother exchanged another glance with my father before responding. "Several factors. Our meetings with Dr. Lindstrom helped us recognize patterns we'd been blind to for years. Reading Olivia's framework was illuminating. Painful, certainly, but illuminating." She paused, seeming to choose her words carefully. "But what ultimately convinced us was something more fundamental." "What was that?" I asked quietly. "Trust," she said simply. Not our trust in you, though that's certainly present, but the recognition that you have no reason to trust us. Not after what we've done. Your framework offers a path forward based not on blind faith, but on demonstrated change. It's exactly what this situation demands. My father cleared his throat. We also realize something about you, Olivia, that we've consistently failed to appreciate. Throughout your life, we've interpreted your self-sufficiency as evidence that you needed less from us, when in reality, it was an adaptation to getting less. Your framework isn't excessive or punitive. It's proportionate to rebuilding what's been systematically damaged over many years. Their insight into patterns I had struggled to articulate even to myself was unexpected. It suggested they had engaged in genuine self-reflection rather than merely strategic acceptance aimed at minimizing consequences. Dr. Lindstrom mentioned you met with her, my mother added. She didn't share the content of your conversation. Of course, but she did say it confirmed her belief that our family has the capacity for significant healing if we commit fully to the process. Mr. Winters interjected smoothly, bringing us back to the pragmatic aspects of the agreement. Given this acceptance, I've prepared the formal documentation that will codify both the financial restitution plan and the relational restoration framework. He distributed folders containing the legal agreements. These documents transform your framework into binding commitments with specific timelines, responsibilities, and accountability mechanisms. As I reviewed the documents, I noted that Mr. Winters had skillfully translated my conceptual framework into concrete, enforceable terms without losing the spirit of healing that underlay the proposal. The financial restitution elements were detailed and precise, with clear timelines for asset liquidation and transfer. The relational restoration components were equally well defined, specifying the frequency and format of family therapy sessions, the structure of family meetings, and the benchmarks for assessing progress. These look comprehensive, I acknowledged, impressed by the thoroughness of the translation from concept to contract. Before we proceed with signatures, Mr. Winters said, I want to emphasize something important. While these documents create legal obligations regarding the financial aspects, the relational components are not typically enforceable through traditional legal means. Their inclusion here represents a moral rather than legally binding commitment. My father looked directly at me. We understand that distinction, and we want you to know that we view the relational commitments as equally binding, regardless of their legal status. This isn't about compliance with a document, it's about rebuilding trust through consistent action over time. My mother nodded in agreement. We're entering into this with full awareness that genuine change requires more than signatures on paper. It requires sustained effort and willingness to engage with difficult truths about ourselves and our family patterns. Their words reflected exactly the understanding I had hoped to establish, that while the legal framework provided necessary structure, the real work would happen in the consistent daily choices that would gradually rebuild trust and establish healthier dynamics. There's one additional element I'd like to discuss, I said, having given this careful thought over the weekend. Vanessa's role in this process. My parents exchanged glances, clearly uncertain about this new direction. I had a conversation with her last week about my counterproposal, I explained. She expressed interest in being included in the family therapy component, though her financial responsibilities would necessarily differ from yours given her economic situation. What did you have in mind? My father asked cautiously. I believe she should participate fully in the relational restoration aspects, the therapy sessions, family meetings, and communication practices. It wouldn't make sense to rebuild family dynamics without including all family members. I paused, considering how to frame the financial aspect. Regarding restitution, she's already developing her own plan for what she can reasonably contribute based on her actual income. It's modest, compared to the overall amount, but it represents significant commitment given her financial reality. My mother nodded thoughtfully. That seems appropriate. Her participation in the process matters more than the dollar amount she can contribute. Exactly, I agreed. This isn't about extracting maximum financial restitution. It's about establishing patterns of accountability and responsibility that create the foundation for healthier relationships going forward. Mr. Winters made some notes. I can prepare an addendum that incorporates Vanessa into the agreement with these specifications. Would you like to delay signing until that's completed? I considered this briefly, then shook my head. I think we should proceed with this agreement today. The addendum can be incorporated once Vanessa and I have finalized the details of her participation. We spent the next hour reviewing the documents in detail, clarifying specific provisions, and asking questions about implementation. Throughout the process, I observed my parents engaged in a way I had rarely seen, asking thoughtful questions, listening attentively to explanations, demonstrating genuine commitment to understanding rather than simply complying. When we finally signed the agreements, multiple copies with formal witnesses present, the moment felt significant beyond the legal implications. We were not just documenting a settlement, but codifying a commitment to transformation, a willingness to dismantle destructive patterns and build something healthier in their place. As we gathered our copies and prepared to leave, my father paused, his expression solemn. Olivia, I want you to know something. While I deeply regret the circumstances that led us here, I'm grateful for the framework you've created. It offers a clarity and purpose I've been lacking for some time. He hesitated, then added simply, Thank you for not giving up on the possibility of change. His words weren't accompanied by dramatic emotion or grand promises, just a quiet acknowledgement of the opportunity contained within the painful process we had navigated. And somehow, that understated recognition felt more genuine than any emotional declaration could have been. Walking out of Mr. Winters' office that afternoon, I felt a curious mixture of exhaustion and hope. The road ahead would undoubtedly contain challenges, moments of regression, uncomfortable confrontations, the hard work of establishing new patterns to replace deeply ingrained ones. But for the first time, that path forward seemed not just possible but deliberately mapped, with clear markers and shared commitment to the journey. 3 weeks after signing the agreement, our family gathered for our first official therapy session with Dr. Lindstrom. The setting was intentionally neutral, neither her office nor any family member's home, but a private consultation room she occasionally used for family work, with comfortable seating arranged in a circle without the barriers of desks or tables between us. I arrived early, a habit developed through years of ensuring I would never be the one holding others up or creating inconvenience. Vanessa arrived shortly after, looking uncharacteristically subdued in simple jeans and a sweater rather than her usual fashionable attire. We exchanged awkward smiles but little conversation as we waited for our parents and Dr. Lindstrom. Nervous? Vanessa finally asked, breaking the silence. A little, I admitted. This feels like uncharted territory. She nodded, fidgeting, with the strap of her purse. I've never done therapy before. Mom and Dad always said our family was too practical for that sort of thing. The observation struck me as revealing. How our parents had framed vulnerability and emotional work as somehow impractical or unnecessary, positioning stoicism as strength while avoiding the deeper work of authentic connection. Dr. Lindstrom arrived next, setting up a small digital recorder with our permission and arranging her notes. The first session often feels awkward, she acknowledged, noticing our discomfort. That's completely normal. We're establishing new patterns of interaction, which inherently feels unfamiliar. My parents entered together, my father carrying a portfolio containing their progress notes, one of the accountability measures outlined in our agreement. Each family member was required to document observations, challenges, and insights between sessions to ensure consistent engagement with the process rather than compartmentalizing the work to therapy hours alone. After brief introductions and an overview of how these sessions would be structured, Dr. Lindstrom began with a disarmingly simple question. What does each of you hope to gain from this process? The directness of her approach cut through the tension, forcing us beyond social niceties into substantive territory immediately. She turned to my father first, perhaps sensing he was the most likely to offer a surface-level response if given time to observe others' answers. He cleared his throat, caught off guard by being addressed first. I want. He paused, seeming to reconsider his initial response. I want to understand how we got here. Not just the trust fund situation, but the patterns that made it possible. And I want to learn how to be the father Olivia deserves, not just the father she's had to adapt to. The unexpected depth of his answer shifted something in the room. My mother followed, her voice quieter than usual. I want to rebuild what I've damaged through my choices. I've spent so many years maintaining appearances rather than addressing realities. I want to learn how to be authentic instead of perfect. When Vanessa's turn came, she surprised me with her vulnerability. I want to understand who I am outside of being the family favorite, she said, not meeting anyone's eyes. I've built my identity around being the one who needs taking care of, who gets special treatment. I don't know who I am without that role, and I need to find out. Finally, Dr. Lindstrom turned to me. I had prepared an answer, something measured and reasonable about healthy boundaries and equitable family dynamics. But hearing the raw honesty from the others compelled me toward greater authenticity. I want to stop being the responsible one, I said, the words emerging before I'd fully formed the thought. I'm tired of being the family member who makes things easier for everyone else, who accommodates, who understands, who forgives. I want to discover who I am when I'm not defined by my response to this family's dysfunction. Dr. Lindstrom nodded, acknowledging each response without judgment. What strikes me immediately is how each of you has identified a core pattern that has defined your role within the family system. Richard, the provider who focused on practical matters rather than emotional understanding. Catherine, the maintainer of appearances who prioritized external validation. Vanessa, the dependent one whose needs structured family decisions. And Olivia, the accommodator who adapted to support the system rather than challenge it. She paused, allowing her observations to settle. These aren't random roles. They formed an interlocking system where each position reinforced the others. For meaningful change to occur, we'll need to dismantle this system and establish healthier patterns of interaction. This won't happen quickly or easily, but the awareness you're already demonstrating suggests it's possible. Over the next 90 minutes, Dr. Lindstrom guided us through exercises designed to illuminate these patterns in action. She had us recall a specific family holiday, with each person describing their experience and perspective. The differences in our recollections were striking. Events I remembered as painful exclusions, Vanessa recalled as simply normal family dynamics. Decisions my father considered pragmatic financial choices, I experienced as value statements about my worth relative to my sister's. What emerged most clearly was not malicious intent, but profound disconnection. We had occupied the same physical space for decades, while experiencing fundamentally different emotional realities. This divergence in perspective is actually valuable information, Dr. Lindstrom noted as the session neared its conclusion. It highlights how family members can participate in the same events, yet interpret them through entirely different lenses, shaped by their roles and positions within the system. She assigned us homework for the week ahead, structured conversation exercises designed to practice new communication patterns, reflection questions to explore independently, and reading. Materials about family systems theory to provide context for our work. As we prepared to leave, Dr. Lindstrom offered one final observation. What I witnessed today was significant courage from each of you. Examining entrenched patterns requires vulnerability and willingness to question fundamental assumptions about yourselves and your relationships. That you've begun this process with such honesty suggests capacity for genuine transformation. Walking to the parking lot afterward, I felt emotionally drained, yet curiously energized. The session had been uncomfortable, certainly, but it had also validated perceptions I had questioned for years. Hearing my family members acknowledge patterns I had previously navigated alone felt like removing a heavy backpack I'd grown so accustomed to carrying that I'd forgotten it was there. My father approached as I reached my car. "That was harder than I expected," he admitted, his typical confidence noticeably absent. "It was," I agreed, unsure what else to say. He hesitated, then added, "I kept thinking about all the times I dismissed therapy as unnecessary, calling it indulgent or impractical. I'm beginning to understand why I did that." "Why?" I asked, genuinely curious. "Because examining these patterns means confronting how I've failed as a father. It was easier to dismiss the process than face what it would reveal." He met my eyes directly, something rare in our interactions. "I'm sorry for that, Olivia. For all the ways I've prioritized my comfort over your needs." The simple acknowledgement, delivered without expectation of immediate forgiveness or reassurance, felt like the first brick in a new foundation. Not the completion of anything, but the beginning of something built on honesty rather than evasion. As I drove home, I reflected on how differently this process was unfolding than I had anticipated. I had expected resistance disguised as compliance, surface-level participation without genuine engagement. Instead, I was witnessing what appeared to be sincere effort to understand and address long-standing patterns. Whether this momentum would sustain through the more challenging work ahead remained to be seen. But for the first time, I allowed myself to consider the possibility that authentic healing, not just financial restitution or superficial reconciliation, but fundamental transformation of our family system, might actually be possible. 2. Months into our family's healing process, I received an update from Mr. Winters that marked the first major milestone in the financial restitution plan. My parents had completed the sale of their home, the sprawling Tudor-style house where Vanessa and I had grown up, and transferred the substantial proceeds directly into the trust recovery account. "The closing went smoothly," Mr. Winters explained as we met in his office reviewing the documentation.